I said on Thursday morning when I was here that that evening in my county in Virginia, Shenandoah County, Virginia, near the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley, which is a most beautiful area, uh, that there was going to be a meeting of the school board in which I anticipated that the school board was going to decide to undo the decision that had been made in 2020 in the wake of the George Floyd highlighting of some of our racial history and enduring problems around race, around the persecution of Black people, uh, that the school board in 2020 changed the names of schools that are named after Confederate generals uh, to more neutral things. My son, when he was in elementary school, and we lived here in the forested mountains on the western flank of the Shenandoah Valley, he went to Ashby Lee Elementary School, and Ashby and Lee are two Confederate heroes, as the local population sees it. And he got his high school education elsewhere when we were gone for a while to New Mexico. But had he not gone to Albuquerque, he would have gone to Stonewall Jackson High School. And Stonewall Jackson, I expect most people know, is a Confederate hero of a particular shining sort. Came from further down south in the Shenandoah Valley via Virginia Military Institute. I think he taught at down in Lexington, all part of the congressional district, which I ran for Congress back in 2012. So there are a lot of ways of looking at this thing that I've been exposed to, including doing talk radio here for a decade before the whole political path opened that I thought I had to do. So when the school names got changed, there was a popular uprising here in Shenandoah County. I mean, people were really up in arms, practically literally in arms. But no, the violence has not been an issue. It's one of the things I appreciate about the Shenandoah County culture and the Shenandoah Valley culture. I did a lot of shows on the radio in which I was very challenging to some basic beliefs held by a lot of people in this area, which is fundamentalist and conservative and Confederate. And I came to appreciate that there were no threats on my personal safety, and still have not been, even though I'm really a gadfly, as you'll hear in my op-ed piece I'm about to read about the school name changing. So anyway, the meeting was held. It was a really big deal. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of people. I got an estimate of maybe 400 people, and 60 people got up to speak before the school board, after which the school board members spoke, and then they voted, and it was 5-1 to change the names back to the Confederate heroes that the schools had long been named after, and to ditch the names that were so neutral, like Mountain View, and so I had a column in the newspapers that carry my op-eds every week in the district where I ran for Congress, unsuccessfully, as you might imagine, in an area that's 2-1 Republican in this era where you can't get through to people very easily. And I was the Democratic nominee. So, but I was able a little over a decade ago to parlay my having become that kind of a figure into having a niche in which I get to send messages to the region, not as a political candidate, but as a columnist. And so this is the piece that I wrote that'll give you an idea of how I look at these things, which, by the way, is somewhat indicative of the larger picture of how I see the force of brokenness and the need to align ourselves with the truth if we're going to make a more whole world. I get very disturbed about the role of falsehoods in making our human world worse than it should be, and I believe worse than it needs to be, worse than we could make it into, if we understood more fully what we're up against, which is the title of that book. So here's the op-ed piece that ran this past weekend in newspapers, in what used to be the 6th district, congressional district in Virginia, which was represented then by Bob Goodlatte, a 20-year Republican, and is represented now by a fellow named Ben Klein, whom I got to know a little bit. Really disturbing to see how he has aligned himself with the worst parts of the Republican Party and spews things which are completely distorting the nature of the actual political reality of these times. And he seemed like a nice guy, and he had a lovely wife and 2 beautiful twin daughters. That there were babies then, and one joined together in one carriage. But that was 12 years ago, so one can imagine that they are young ladies now growing up in a nice family where their father's out spewing lies to put him in service of the MAGA force, which has a lot to do with the Confederate force, as I've argued in previous pieces. If you'd like to follow up on that idea, go to my library of videos on YouTube and look up Confederacy or Confederate, and you'll see that this is a continuation of something. And so I have studied the rise of the Confederacy in considerable detail, and I mean depth. And so this is really part of the American political crisis of today. So I am very motivated, just as I'm motivated to overcome the force of fascism in America today. I'm also motivated to shine the light of truth onto the Confederacy so that it can stop playing the role that it now plays in our politics, and has played, well, since before the Civil War, of course, and during the Civil War, but ever since as well, because a wide swath of America has a relationship with the Confederacy that rests on falsehoods and that functions in a destructive way. All right. Enough preamble. By the time this piece appears, I wrote in my op-ed, I expect that Shenandoah County will have decided to change some school names, reverting to those honored Confederate heroes like Stonewall Jackson High School and Ashby Lee Elementary School. As far as I know, this would give Shenandoah County the distinction of being the first school district among those around the old Confederacy that have abandoned pro-Confederate names to reverse that change. And let me say this, interjected, that this story, which I thought was going to be interesting, but was also sort of local, became a big story nationally and I think somewhat internationally. I think the BBC covered it. It was on the front page of the New York Times. It was covered by Reuters. And my daughter's Apple News feed featured it among the 3 leading stories. So this turned out to be a big story. And here's my county playing this role. That would affirm my previous judgment that while the school board of 2020 was right on the value of changing in that direction away from the Confederacy, it chose a counterproductive way of effecting change. The culture of the region had long held the Confederacy as an important part of its identity. And while the school board of 2020 was right that there was something problematic about that, changing the names on buildings did nothing to change the cultural beliefs and feelings those Confederate names have been expressing. Stonewall Jackson High School, it turns out, will remain the more valid message so long as a preponderance of the people of the area hold in their minds the understanding of the Confederacy that has been taught in the South for a century and a half. And so long as they feel that fierce loyalty that was expressed in the popular uprising that is restoring Stonewall Jackson's name to that school. Instead of changing the message of an unchanged pro-Confederate populace, the school board might have raised the issue as a teachable moment. School boards should be good at teaching. Some kind of educational process. Educational because the continuing celebration of the Confederacy among its heirs is built upon historical falsehoods. And it is reasonable to assume that if the people held a historically valid view of the history and meaning of the Confederacy, they would be more willing to define their identity differently. As I look at that, how reasonable is it to assume that if they saw the truth, they would be inclined to relinquish an attachment that's based upon falsehoods? I guess I don't really know the full psychology of that kind of a connection. I think I understand the psychology that would resist knowing the truth if it called into question how noble it was to be aligned with these Confederate heroes that fought against the war of Northern aggression and fought for the honor of the South and that fought for states' rights and the noble lost cause, and the South will rise again. People's emotional attachments, I have certainly found, are not easily swayed by mere truth. So, but that's my stock in trade, is the truth. So here I am in this op-ed piece, putting in front of conservative Confederate loving people in this very red region through the newspapers. So it appears as an op-ed piece on their breakfast table, something that talks about educational moments and then attempts some way of educating people through the op-ed. With some creativity, a series of public meetings could have been organized to fashion constructive forms of dialogue, combined with an appropriate way of teaching the real history of the Confederacy, a real history that would correct the false history whose transmission the ruling powers of the South have enforced since immediately after the Civil War. Like I said, I've studied that era and the working of the Confederate force, the slave power, in depth. And even into the 20th century, you see that there are ways of coercing the educational process of the southern region into conveying a picture that historians right now would say is essentially false. Here's what I say is the real history of the Confederacy that you would want people to understand if you could convey it. A series of 4 bullet points. The Confederacy was about protecting the slavery economy and the ability of that economy to expand geographically, as the leaders of the South made clear from the moment the process of secession began. It was all about slavery. Because it was all about the right of white people to treat black people as human livestock, the Confederacy itself was all about white supremacy. The slaveholding elite, who were the only beneficiaries of slavery, was able to raise an army of men whom that slave-based economy actually made poorer. In other words, the powers that governed the South were able to get people to put their lives on the line and sacrifice a great deal to protect a system that was against their own basic economic interests. And the final bullet point, the South's decision to secede, asserting a right that required being established by legal process, was lawless. That lawless made it President Lincoln's constitutional obligation to subdue that insurrection by force. And by the way, in putting this piece out to those newspaper audiences, I was continuing something that I'd actually been doing for over the last year or year and a half, a couple of pieces about the Confederacy. So this idea that the South's secession, a unilateral assertion of a right that the President of the United States denied that they had, was lawless, that they had no right to declare what the Constitution did or did not allow them to do. That violated the basic American covenant that we settle our conflicts by the rule of law, which would have meant taking the issue to the Supreme Court. But in this piece, all I do is say, I just declare it was lawless. I declare that the Southerns, as they seceded, asserted a right that they required to have established by a legal process because we had signed an agreement that the rule of law, and not just the assertion of power by mere citizens, willing to back up that assertion by raising an army and fighting a civil war, that is lawless. I just say that here, asserting a right. And then I say, if the people, if they, meaning the people of, say, Shenandoah County, understood those realities, how many people would be passionate to celebrate as heroes those figures of the Confederacy? At this point, I just sort of imagine. I mean, if you know the history of the South and the history of the celebration of the Civil War and its heroes, the Confederate heroes, which didn't arise, by the way, at random times, is a very clear a very clear connection with the issue of white supremacy, that when white supremacy was being challenged, that's when the statues would be commissioned to put in the park. It was the stars and bars and these Confederate statues and the naming of schools. Stonewall Jackson High School was named Stonewall Jackson at a time when Virginia was resisting Brown versus the board's decision that public schools needed to integrate. But if you've got a culture that has saturated people's minds with a teaching of that sort, and you talk about an educational process to change it, well, I get to that later in the piece. It sure isn't going to happen overnight. And I think that that's okay. What matters is to find the best way of healing what's broken. And often healing what's broken in our world requires years or even generations. But you only can do what you can do. You're not going to change that by changing the letters tacked to the side of a building, from Stonewall Jackson to Mountain View. That doesn't change anything. And what matters is the consciousness of people. A lot of these, I would assume that almost everybody who worked to get this new school board that would make the change back to the Confederate heroes, they will all vote for Donald Trump. I mean, I would bet it would be a very negligible part of them that wouldn't. And in both cases, it's got to do with people looking at the world, the larger world, and seeing it in terms that are substantially false. Whether it's Trump's lies about, he did nothing wrong when it's just so obvious, or whether it's what the Confederacy was about. There's a deep cultural pattern that one is up against. But to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, you got to go to war with the army you got, or in this case, you got to fight from where things are. And things are very broken in a lot of ways. And part of the way things are broken is that a lot of people have been brought up to be fairly readily led to believe things that are contrary to huge bodies of evidence. I'll go back to the text. What makes a change in that pro-Confederacy identity, socially and politically desirable, is that this enduring Confederate identity, like the Confederacy itself, has a destructive impact on the American body politic. Destructive in that it stands for conflict. That battle flag came into existence in the context of a terrible civil war. And it continues to be divisive in relation to the rest of America. All of that America that doesn't name its schools after Confederate generals. And here I indulge myself in an interpretation and an assertion about the spirit expressed by the stars and bars flying on people's flagpoles. And I drive past Confederate flags pretty much any time I go anywhere. And stuck onto vehicles, the spirit of that is one of anger and resentment and a strong us versus them way of looking at many of their fellow countrymen. The wielding of pro-Confederate symbols expresses more the spirit that's fired on Fort Sumter than an extension of a hand of goodwill and cooperation. And then I'm talking about why it's right to hope that we can get away from this. And the first thing is that divisive spirit that it embodies. And then there's this element of race. And by the way, bigotries of all kinds and us versus them mentalities and conflict orientation, all parts of the pattern of brokenness that works together, that forms alliances, that creates a destructive force that moves through our world. This is one view into the destructive force that we're up against now, and the view of the history of how that has manifested itself over a lot of American history. The element of race. History shows how central white supremacy has been a part of the meaning of both the Confederacy, in which they fought for the system that allowed white people to own black people as property, and of the cultural political force that has persisted since the Civil War, through generations of Jim Crow and enforced segregation, all the way to the current disenfranchisement of black people. All that supports the desire of the 2020 school board. They're the people who made the change away from the Confederate generals, for Shenandoah County to define the county's identity differently. By the way, one thing I don't touch upon here is it seems to have been important about what message were we sending to the wider world about who and what we were. They didn't want to send, we're part of the Confederacy as a message to the wider world, thinking that we're not going to attract the kind of people that we want to attract. I understand that. I understand that when people on the right parade certain kinds of bigoted ugliness. I think of what happened in North Carolina when they passed some kind of LGBTQ kind of, that they were boycotted, that organizations changed their conventions from Charlotte to some other city in order to send North Carolina a message. So I can understand that if the school board sees its mission as having this piece of the Confederacy send the world a message, that's not who we are anymore. Now we have joined America in general and are not broadcasting to the world that we're aligned with the people who drove us to the Civil War. I understand the desire to send that different message, but you gotta deal with the reality. I mean, if you want to send a message about what this county is, you got to change what the county is. And the county is embodied in the culture that's embedded in the hearts and minds of the people. And when they made that change, they discovered that the identity wasn't just a matter of what message do we send to the wide world. Identity goes deep. Change is important, but not easy. But it was unwise to ignore the reality and power of that well-entrenched identity. How could changing Stonewall Jackson to Mountain View do anything but provoke those who have been taught for generations to be fiercely loyal to their heroic Confederate ancestors? To them, it's heritage, honoring their ancestors. Heritage, not hate. They don't recognize how much their heritage has been about white people putting black people in a profoundly subordinate position. In other pieces that I've written about the Confederacy, I I quote what's the famous speech of Alexander Stephens, he was a senator. He's one of the finer men of the Confederacy. He becomes the vice president under Jefferson Davis, but he delivers this thing that's called the cornerstone speech. And the cornerstone speech, I wish I was better at this age at memorizing words, but he talks about that great moral principle that the white man is superior to the black man, and that the natural, and he thinks this is the principle on which they're founded, is the very opposite of all men are created equal. He is proud that they say it's just the opposite because, the black man is not the equal of the white man, and his proper position in the world is to be subordinated to the will of the white man. It's even good for them. That's what the cornerstone speech was, which was celebrated. I don't know exactly what that celebrated, but they called it the cornerstone speech. I think he uses, Stephens uses the word cornerstone. The cornerstone is white supremacy. They're proud of it. They think it is built into the natural order of things. And of course they would. The culture is dominated by a comparative few people who derive their wealth, and through that their power. Even before we became the United States, a well-entrenched plantation aristocracy, which had its very fine qualities. Like Robert E. Lee, the son of Light Horse Harry Lee. I mean, we can make a case against him on the basis of what he did about slaves and slavery. But he's also somewhat of a magnificent specimen of the Southern aristocracy. It's all been based on something. The heritage has to be understood about what happens when you unleash a slave economy on a region of the country where black slavery proves to be the means to get rich, and where wealth proves to be the means to be able to dominate the society. In a way that there was not the same inequality in the North until, I don't have numbers for this. This is a Schmuckler interpretation based on some knowledge. That it was only in the late 19th century, when you have the age of the robber barons, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts rising, that you get to have the kinds of inequality in the North that existed for a long time in the South. And so you've got a culture which is oriented around domination at a lot of levels. And it results in a lot of brokenness, because inequalities of power inevitably lead to brokenness, which is one of the problems that our constitutional system is supposed to ameliorate. When you get to the point where the Supreme Court says one person, one vote is a basic principle, you're in consent of the governed and the will of the people, even if they started out only with propertied white males. The logic of it led to the idea that all men are created equal means that everybody should have an equal voice. The cornerstone speech said, no, that's just wrong. So that brokenness is part of the heritage. It doesn't have to have racism in all of its ugliness, but a whole lot of ugliness did come along with all that racism. There may have been a lot of benign masters, but there is also something in the culture in which the poorer whites were taught by the richer whites that they were all really in this together, And the consolation to the poorer whites, who were kept poorer than their corresponding people where there wasn't slavery, was, we white folks are superior to them. And so keeping the black person down was an important compensation for the poorer whites who have been conned into supporting something which doesn't really care about their well-being, which is the same thing which is happening right now in America in the same population that created the school board that overturned the change of names. Such identity, fiercely low, and such fierce loyalty to their Confederate ancestors go deep, and deep change is difficult to achieve. But over time, things can change. The school board might have devised a good educational process to begin to overcome a century and a half of cultural teaching at odds with historical reality about the glories of the Confederacy. It might take years, but eventually the point might be reached when the power of historical truth, you can see that I'm really a big believer in the truth, combined with the inevitable ongoing turnover of generations, would have so transformed the culture that changing of the schools' names would be possible without provoking the people to rise up to reverse it. So that piece ran this past weekend in newspapers in the Confederacy, the part of the Confederacy I happen to live in. The whole thinking about school names. Something I've got a certain amount of practice in doing because my wife, and that's her in our wedding picture, that's 1986, went to high school in Jacksonville, Florida, in Nathan Bedford Forrest High School. Now, on the one hand, you can see why somebody might celebrate Nathan Bedford Forrest, because though I'm not really able to make the case for this, that Ken Burns said in his Civil War series, he said that there were two geniuses that emerged in the Civil War. A political genius, and that was Abraham Lincoln, and a military genius, and that was Nathan Bedford Forrest. But there's a problematic aspect, to say the least, about Nathan Bedford Forrest. In addition to his being one more Confederate general, like Stonewall Jackson or something, he's one who committed war crimes in essentially a mass killing of black Union soldiers that he took prisoner. Some battle in Tennessee. And then after the Civil War, he was one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. And it's problematic to honor him. You may be aware of the Tennessee legislature has had forever, maybe it isn't forever, but they've had a big bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest prominently displayed in their legislative halls. And I believe that they succeeded in finally removing that. But anyway, my wife's high school took a long, long time to change its name. And when they did change the name, April, my wife, in touch with some of her former classmates, class of 1970, found out that a lot of those people, and I recall that a lot of her classmates are heritage, not hate types. A lot of those people are not happy about the change. And they say, well, the black people never complained. You know, they did have integration had taken place in recent years. It was very new for that class, and there were black people that they went to high school with, and these white people all claim that the black people had no problem with it. So what's the point? I've been to two of those reunions, the 20th and the 30th, and it is noteworthy that a lot of people come back for the reunions. Not a single black person from the class of 1970 comes back. Now, what does that say about nothing made that they didn't feel in some way excluded? Who knows how much of it's got to do with the name, but the name expresses the situation. The situation expresses the culture, and the culture was not one that was happy to integrate, and that went way out of its way after the Civil War to put the black people back into a grotesquely subordinate position in which they would be tyrannized and terrorized for generations. And to get a Supreme Court to essentially authorize by declaring that separate but equal was fine, when it was clear that the separate was anything but equal. And the 14th Amendment that called for equal protection under the law, was simply run roughshod by this enduring spirit of the South that gave us the Confederacy to preserve slavery. And by the way, people should know, the election of Lincoln did not threaten the continuation of the slave economy where it already existed. He was very forthright. He didn't have the constitutional authority to change anything about that system where it already existed. The whole fight had been and was over the ability of the slave empire to expand. And the South was deeply on the offensive with various things like the shenanigans to stack the deck in Kansas, to violate the rule of law and seize power there, but also with the decision in Dred Scott. They were fighting to be able to have slavery exportable to the whole of the United States. They were going from things like the Missouri Compromise, where a line gets drawn above the line, no slavery, to they were going on the offensive to we claim the right to take our slavery anywhere. But you'll when they debated this thing at the meeting of the school board, a lot of the focus was on how would black people feel. Imagine how black people feel, you know, which is a legitimate way of talking about it. And the NAACP of Virginia, as soon as this thing was, you know, looked like it was on the verge of happening, came out with a statement saying they abhor the idea of reverting to them. So how the black people feel about it is really a legitimate thing. But it is noteworthy in terms of understanding me and what I believe is an important part of the healing of our world, is that I go after the falsehoods. I don't say a word in that op-ed piece about how would black people feel if they changed the names back. I'm thinking that, and I'm caring about that. But my energy is this whole thing is based on false beliefs about the history and meaning of the Confederacy. And that those false beliefs are tied in with a lot of what's going wrong in America right now.